The glass in my hand had not even reached my lips when her voice cut through the entire hall. "Is this the human they let sit at our table?" Every head turned. I felt the heat of 100 eyes land on me at once, and I had not even finished walking through the door of the grand reception hall on Solace Station. The air smelled of strange spice and cold metal, and the lights above glowed a pale violet that made every Varathi face look sharp and unreadable. I was the only human in a room of over 200 guests, and I had known that walking in, I had not expected to be the first thing anyone talked about. My name is Ethan Marsh. I was 26 years old, a systems engineer assigned to the human delegation on Solace Station, a neutral meeting point built between human space and the territory of the Varathi Dominion. I was not a diplomat. I was not important. I fixed reactors, repaired old shuttle engines, and solved problems nobody else wanted to touch. I had been invited to this reception because my supervisor was sick, and someone from our side needed to stand in the room and represent Earth, even if only to nod politely and eat strange food. I had not planned on being noticed. I had planned on standing near the wall, drinking something I did not recognize, and leaving early. That plan ended the moment Princess Thalira Vex decided to speak. She stood near the center of the hall, surrounded by a circle of Varathi nobles who all seemed to lean toward her like plants toward sunlight. She was young, 19 by human years, though the Varathi aged differently than we did, so she looked closer to a human in her early 20s. Her skin held a faint silver sheen under the lights, and her eyes were a deep violet that seemed to catch every reflection in the room. She wore robes stitched with threads that shimmered like liquid metal, marking her as royalty even to someone who had never seen a Varathi noble before. She was striking in the way storms are striking. You could admire it from a distance, but you did not want to stand underneath it. "I asked a question," she said, her voice carrying easily across the hall. "Is this truly the representative Earth has sent us? A mechanic?" A few nobles laughed quietly behind their hands. I stood still, glass in hand, and said nothing yet. I had learned a long time ago that silence gives you a moment to think, and thinking is rarely a bad idea when someone is trying to provoke you. "I am Ethan Marsh," I said finally, keeping my voice even. "I am here on behalf of the human delegation." "On behalf of," she repeated, tasting the words like they amused her. "Yes, that much is clear. Your species sends whatever it has left when the important matters are unavailable." More laughter. Not loud, not crude, but the kind of laughter people give when they know their leader wants them to laugh. I looked around the hall for a moment. Grace Linford, the only other human on the station that night, stood near the far wall, watching from a position where fewer people would notice her. She caught my eye and gave the smallest shake of her head, the kind that meant, "Do not take the bait." I was not planning to. "Your species," the princess continued, stepping closer, "built ships that fall apart if a rock the size of a fist strikes them. Your species still burns fuel the way primitive creatures burn wood, and yet here you stand, in a hall built by minds far beyond your own, expecting respect." I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like the quiet ache of being reduced to nothing in front of strangers. I thought about arguing. I thought about listing every reason she was wrong, about telling her that humanity had clawed its way into space through nothing but stubbornness and hard work, that we had survived disasters that would have ended lesser species, that we deserved to be here as much as anyone in that hall. But arguing with someone who has already decided you are beneath them rarely changes their mind. It only gives them more reasons to keep talking. "You have nothing to say," she said, tilting her head, clearly enjoying herself now. "Of course, even your silence proves my point. A creature that got lucky with fire, mistaking survival for achievement." The hall went quiet, waiting to see what I would do. I could feel Grace watching me from across the room, could feel the weight of every Varathi eye, curious to see whether the human would beg, argue, or simply crumble under the pressure of being mocked by royalty. I set my glass down on the table beside me, slow and deliberate, so the sound of glass touching metal was the only noise in the hall. I looked at her for one long moment, not with anger, not with fear, just a plain, steady look, the kind you give someone you have already decided is not worth your time. Then I gave a small nod, more to myself than to her, turned around, and walked out of the hall without a single word. I did not slam the door. I did not storm out. I simply walked, footsteps even, back straight, until the doors closed behind me and the noise of the hall faded into silence. Behind me, I later learned, the silence lasted far longer than any argument would have. Grace told me afterward that for almost 10 full seconds, nobody in that hall spoke at all. The princess, who had expected either anger or submission, had received neither. She had expected a reaction and gotten nothing but the sound of my footsteps fading down the corridor. I did not think much of it at the time. I walked back to the human quarters section of the station, changed out of the formal clothing I had borrowed for the evening, and sat by the window that looked out over the curve of the station and the stars beyond it. Solace Station orbited a quiet gas giant, its rings catching the light of a distant sun, and I stared at that view for a long while, letting the tension drain out of my shoulders. I was not angry. That surprised me a little. I had expected to feel humiliated, maybe even furious, but instead I felt strangely calm, the way you feel after setting down something heavy you had been carrying for too long. I thought about why. I had grown up in a small town outside a city that had been hit hard during the resource shortages of my childhood, back when parts of Earth were still recovering from decades of strain over dwindling water and farmland. I remembered watching adults argue over things that could not be fixed by shouting, watching people waste their energy trying to convince others of their worth, instead of simply proving it through what they did. My father, a quiet man who repaired water systems for a living, used to tell me that the people who needed to shout the loudest to be respected usually did not have much else to offer. Respect, he said, is not something you demand. It is something you earn through what you build, not what you say. I had carried that lesson with me through school, through the years of training that eventually led me into engineering, and through every job I had taken since. When people mocked me, and there had been plenty who did, especially early in my career when I was younger and less experienced, I had learned that arguing back rarely changed anything. It usually just gave the other person more to work with. Walking away, staying calm, and letting my work speak for itself had always served me better. So when the princess of an ancient, powerful species stood in front of 200 people and told me my entire species was nothing more than lucky animals, I did not feel the need to prove her wrong with words. I simply did not see the point in staying in a room where nothing I said would matter. I did not know, sitting there by that window with the rings of the gas giant glowing faintly outside, that my silence would matter far more than any argument could have. The next morning, I went back to work as if nothing had happened. My job on Solace Station involved maintaining the environmental systems in the sections used by smaller trade delegations, species whose technology was not advanced enough to bring their own life support teams. It was steady work, checking oxygen mixtures, calibrating filtration units, repairing small malfunctions before they became large ones. I liked it because it required focus, and focus left little room for thinking about anything else. Around midday, Grace found me in one of the maintenance corridors, her arms crossed, a look on her face that told me she had something to say. "You're the talk of the station," she said. I did not look up from the panel I was working on. "I doubt that. I'm serious, Ethan. Word is spreading fast. Apparently nobody has ever seen someone just walk away like that. Not from a Varathi noble, not from anyone important. People don't walk away from Thalira Vex. They apologize, or they argue, or they cry. You just left." "I didn't see much point in staying," I said, tightening a bolt on the panel in front of me. Grace leaned against the wall, watching me for a moment. "You know what that means to them, right? Composure is everything to the Varathi. It's built into how they measure strength. Someone who reacts with anger or fear is seen as weak. Someone who stays completely calm, especially under pressure meant to break them, that's seen as..." She paused, searching for the right word. "Powerful," she finally said. "You accidentally showed strength by their own definition, and you didn't even mean to." I finally looked up at her. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just didn't feel like arguing with someone who had already made up her mind about me. "Maybe not," Grace said, "but from what I'm hearing, half the station thinks you did it on purpose. some kind of calculated move to embarrass her in front of her own people. I almost laughed. I promise you, there was no calculation. I was just tired of being talked down to. Grace studied me for a moment longer, then shook her head slightly, a small smile forming at the corner of her mouth. Well, whatever it was, it worked. The princess apparently hasn't said much since last night. Her advisor came by our section this morning, asking questions about you. That got my attention. Questions? What kind of questions? Where you were from? What your role was? Whether you were some kind of diplomat in disguise? Grace shrugged. I told him the truth. You're an engineer, nothing more. I frowned, unsure how to feel about a member of Varathi royalty asking about me at all. Why would they care? Grace's smile widened slightly. I think you confused them, Ethan. And people who are used to being feared or admired don't know what to do when someone is neither afraid of them nor impressed by them. I did not have an answer for that. I went back to my work, checking the readings on the panel in front of me, and tried not to think too much about a princess I had spoken to for less than 2 minutes and would likely never see again. I was wrong about that, though I did not know it yet. The corridor lights flickered once, a small reminder that even this quiet station had its share of problems waiting to be solved, and somewhere above me, in the elegant halls reserved for royalty, a young princess sat alone with a question she could not shake loose, turning it over again and again like a stone she could not put down. 2 days passed without incident. I kept to my usual routine, working through the maintenance schedules assigned to my section, eating meals alone or occasionally with Grace, and spending my evenings by the same window, watching the rings of the gas giant catch the light. The station buzzed with its usual mix of trade negotiations, cultural exchanges, and the quiet tension that came from housing dozens of species who did not always trust one another. I heard occasional whispers about the reception, about the human who had walked away from royalty without a word, but the story seemed to fade the way most gossip does, replaced by newer, more urgent concerns. A shipment of rare minerals had been delayed. A trade dispute between 2 smaller delegations had turned tense. Life on the station moved forward, and I assumed my brief moment of unintentional attention had passed with it. On the 3rd day, I was called to a section of the station I rarely visited, the diplomatic wing reserved for high-ranking officials and their guests. My supervisor, still recovering from illness but well enough to send instructions through the station network, informed me that there was an issue with the environmental controls in the Varathi diplomatic suites, and since I was the only engineer currently certified to work on systems using Varathi components, I was the one being sent to fix it. I did not think much of it at first. Broken systems needed fixing, regardless of who used them. I gathered my tools and made my way through the quiet, elegant corridors of the diplomatic wing, corridors lined with soft lighting and patterns carved into the walls that seemed to shift slightly depending on the angle you viewed them from. When I reached the suite listed on my assignment, I found the door already open, and inside, waiting for me, was Princess Thalira Vex. She stood near the center of the room, her arms crossed, watching the doorway as if she had been expecting me for some time. Up close, without the crowd of nobles surrounding her, she looked younger than she had in the hall, though her expression remained just as sharp. "You," she said, her tone unreadable. "They sent you." I stopped in the doorway, tool bag in hand. I was told there was a problem with the environmental controls. "There is," she said. "The air recycling system has been failing off and on for the past day. My advisors called for a technician. I did not expect it to be you." I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to proceed. The last time we had spoken, she had insulted my entire species in front of 200 people, and I had walked away without a word. Now I was standing in her private quarters, expected to fix a problem for the very person who had mocked me. I decided the simplest path forward was the same one I always chose. Do the job, stay professional, and leave without unnecessary conflict. "I'll take a look," I said, stepping into the room and moving toward the panel on the far wall where the environmental controls were housed. She watched me in silence as I worked, her violet eyes following my hands as I opened the panel and began checking the connections inside. The system was Varathi made, more advanced than anything humans had built, but the basic principles of airflow and filtration were not so different from the systems I worked on every day. It took me a few minutes to identify the issue, a small component that had begun to overheat due to a buildup of dust from the station's ventilation system, something that likely would have gone unnoticed for weeks if left unchecked. "It's a minor issue," I said, reaching for the replacement part in my tool bag. "The filtration component overheated. I can replace it now, should take about 10 minutes. She did not respond right away. When I glanced back at her, I found her studying me with an expression I could not quite place, something between curiosity and suspicion. "You are not going to say anything about the reception," she said finally. It was not a question. I focused on the panel in front of me, removing the damaged component carefully. I wasn't planning to. Why not? I paused, considering how to answer honestly, without starting an argument I had no interest in having. Because it wouldn't change anything. You said what you said. I don't need you to apologize, and I'm not interested in arguing about it. I have a job to do, and I'd like to do it well. Silence followed my words, long enough that I began to wonder if I had offended her further. When I glanced back again, she was still watching me, but the sharpness in her expression had softened slightly, replaced by something more thoughtful. "Most of the species who visit this station," she said slowly, "either fear us or try desperately to impress us. You do neither." "I'm not trying to do anything," I said, fitting the new component into place. "I'm just doing my job." "That is precisely what confuses me," she said, and for the first time, I heard something in her voice that was not mockery or superiority, but genuine curiosity. "You should fear me. I am the heir to the Varathi Dominion. My people have technology your species cannot yet comprehend. One word from me could end your position on this station, perhaps even your career, and yet you speak to me as though I am simply another person standing in the room." I closed the panel and straightened up, brushing dust from my hands. "With respect, Your Highness, I don't think power should change how someone deserves to be treated. I'll treat you the same way I treat everyone else. Politely, honestly, and without pretending to be impressed by things that don't actually matter to me." Her eyes narrowed slightly, though not with anger. It looked more like she was working through a piece of information that did not fit the pattern she had expected. "The system should work properly now," I said, gathering my tools. "If it happens again, let the maintenance office know, and they will send someone out." I turned to leave, and I nearly made it to the door before her voice stopped me. "Ethan Marsh." I turned back, surprised she remembered my name. "Why did you walk away from me that night?" she asked. "In the hall. You could have argued. You could have defended your species. Instead, you simply left. Why?" I considered the question for a moment, choosing my words carefully. Because arguing with someone who has already decided what they think of you rarely changes their mind. It usually just wastes both people's time. I'd rather spend my time doing something useful than convincing someone I don't need to convince of anything. She studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable once again. "That is a strange way to think." "Maybe," I said, "but it has worked for me so far." I left the room without waiting for a response, my footsteps echoing quietly down the elegant corridor of the diplomatic wing. I did not look back, though I could feel her eyes on me until the door closed behind me. I did not know it then, but that conversation, brief as it was, had planted a question in her mind that would not leave easily. A question about a species she had been raised to see as beneath her, and about a man who refused to either fear her or beg for her approval. I walked back toward my own section of the station, thinking little of the exchange beyond the satisfaction of a job well done. I had no way of knowing that the princess who had insulted me in front of 200 people would spend the following days thinking about nothing else. Word travels strangely fast on a station like Solus, where thousands of people from dozens of worlds live pressed together inside the same metal walls. By the following morning, everyone from the cargo handlers to the diplomatic staff seemed to know that the human engineer had been called to repair something in the princess's private quarters, and that he had walked out again without any hint of nervousness. Grace caught up with me again during my midday break, sliding into the seat across from me in the small canteen where I usually ate alone. "You were in her quarters," she said, not quite a question. Fixing a broken filtration system, I said. That's all it was. That's not all anyone else thinks it was. Grace leaned forward, lowering her voice even though the canteen was mostly empty. Ethan, do you understand what's happening here? The Varathi have a very rigid way of viewing strength and weakness. It's baked into their entire culture, going back thousands of years. To them, showing calm under pressure isn't just admirable, it's almost sacred. Their nobility trains from childhood to master their emotions, to never let anyone see them rattled. And here you are, an untrained human mechanic, doing it without even trying. I'm not trying to master anything, I said. I'm just not interested in performing for people who already think less of me. That's exactly the point, Grace said. You're not performing. That's what makes it real to them. A performance can be seen through. What you're doing, they can't explain it away, and that's driving some of them a little crazy. I shook my head, unconvinced that any of this truly mattered beyond a few days of gossip. I think you're reading too much into a broken filtration unit. Grace gave me a look that suggested she thought I was the one missing something obvious, but she let the subject drop, and we finished our meal talking about less complicated things. The upcoming maintenance schedule, a request from one of the smaller delegations for updated air quality reports. Ordinary station business that made the strange tension of the past few days feel a little more distant. That distance did not last long. Later that evening, as I was finishing a routine check on one of the secondary power relays near the diplomatic wing, I noticed a figure standing at the far end of the corridor, half hidden in the shadow of a support column. It took me a moment to recognize her without the formal robes and the crowd of nobles surrounding her. Princess Thalira Vex, dressed in simpler clothing than I had seen her wear before, stood watching me work from a distance, making no effort to approach or announce herself. I finished tightening the panel I had been working on before I acknowledged her presence, mostly because interrupting a task halfway through went against every instinct I had built over years of careful work. When I finally stood and turned toward her, she did not look away or pretend she had not been watching. "Your Highness," I said, giving a small nod of acknowledgement. "Is something wrong with another system?" "No," she said. "I was simply passing through." I doubted that. The diplomatic wing was not a place people simply passed through, and certainly not this particular maintenance corridor, which led nowhere of interest to anyone outside the technical staff. But I did not press the point. "Then I won't keep you," I said, gathering my tools. "You are not curious," she said suddenly, "why I am here." I paused, considering my answer carefully. "I assumed you had your reasons, Your Highness. It's not really my place to ask about them." "Everyone on this station asks about my reasons," she said, a hint of frustration entering her voice for the first time since I had known her. "Every noble, every advisor, every visiting dignitary wants to know my thoughts, my plans, my opinions on every matter of importance. You are the first person in longer than I can remember who has not asked me a single question about myself." I considered that for a moment. "Would you like me to ask?" Something flickered across her face, an expression I could not quite name, somewhere between surprise and uncertainty. "I do not know," she admitted. "I have not been asked what I would like in a very long time." There was something in the way she said it, quiet and almost vulnerable, that caught me off guard. For a moment, I saw past the robes, the title, the sharp words from the reception hall, and saw instead a young woman who had likely spent her entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from her, whether flattery, favor, or fear, and rarely anyone who simply wanted to know how she was doing. "All right," I said. "Why were you really standing in this corridor, Your Highness?" She hesitated, and for a moment I thought she might retreat back into the sharp, dismissive tone she had used at the reception. Instead, she surprised me. "I wanted to understand why you are not afraid of me," she said. "I have tried to think of every explanation. Perhaps you do not understand the extent of my authority. Perhaps you are simply foolish. Perhaps you are hiding some hidden strength beneath your ordinary appearance that I have not yet discovered. None of these explanations satisfy me." "Maybe the explanation is simpler than you think," I said. "Then explain it to me." I considered how to put it into words she might understand. "Where I come from, Respect isn't something that comes from a title or a position of power. It comes from how someone treats others, especially the people who have no power over them at all. I don't fear you because your title doesn't change who you are as a person, at least not in my eyes. If you want my respect, Your Highness, you'll have to earn it the same way anyone else would. For a long moment, she said nothing, simply studying me with those deep violet eyes, as though trying to determine whether I was being sincere or simply clever. That is a dangerous thing to say to someone with my authority, she finally said, though there was no real threat in her voice, more curiosity than warning. Maybe, I said, but it's the truth, and I'd rather be honest than safe. She almost smiled then, a small, fleeting expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared. You are a strange creature, Ethan Marsh. So I've been told, I said. She turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at me over her shoulder. The reception at the reception hall. I spoke without thinking. It is not something I often do. It was not quite an apology, not in the way a human might offer one, but I understood it for what it was, an admission that had likely cost her more than she would ever say aloud. I appreciate you saying that, I said simply. She left without another word, her footsteps fading down the corridor, and I stood there for a long moment afterward, turning over the strange, unexpected conversation in my mind. I had not expected the encounter to end the way it did, and I found myself wondering, not for the first time, what exactly I had stumbled into by simply refusing to argue with a princess who had insulted me in front of 200 strangers. I gathered my tools and made my way back toward the human quarters, the station humming quietly around me, unaware that the conversation in that empty corridor had planted the first small seed of something neither of us fully understood yet, a shift in the way a young princess raised to believe her species stood above all others had begun to see the world, one quiet, unafraid human at a time. The days that followed brought a strange new rhythm to my life on Solace Station. It began with small things, a request for maintenance in a section of the diplomatic wing that never seemed to need maintenance before, an invitation to review environmental reports that any junior technician could have handled just as easily. I noticed the pattern quickly enough, though I said nothing about it, choosing instead to simply do the work asked of me and let the rest unfold on its own. Grace noticed too, of course. She noticed everything. She's finding excuses to see you, Grace said one afternoon, as we walked together toward the cargo bay to inspect a shipment of replacement parts. You do realize that, don't you? I don't know what you mean, I said, though I suspected I did. 3 requests for maintenance in her section this week alone. Ethan, the Varathi build systems that last for decades without failure. Their engineering is not sloppy. Something is happening here, and it isn't a coincidence. I did not have a good answer for that, so I said nothing, and we continued walking in silence until we reached the cargo bay, where a shipment of parts from one of the outer trade routes waited to be inspected and logged. The truth was, I had noticed the pattern as well, and I was not entirely sure how I felt about it. Part of me remained cautious, wary of becoming too comfortable around someone whose species had made their opinion of humanity clear from the very beginning. Another part of me, a part I was reluctant to examine too closely, found myself looking forward to the moments when our paths crossed, brief as they were, professional as I tried to keep them. The next encounter came sooner than I expected. I was summoned again to the diplomatic wing, this time under the pretense of inspecting the entire environmental system for potential future failures, a request that had come directly from the princess's office rather than through the usual maintenance channels. When I arrived, I found her waiting in the same room as before, though this time she was not alone. An older Varathi man stood beside her, his robes marked with symbols I did not recognize, his expression far less curious and far more guarded than hers had ever been toward me. "This is Corin Vale," Thalira said, gesturing toward the man beside her. "My advisor and guardian since childhood. He insisted on being present for this inspection." Corin studied me with an expression that made it clear exactly what he thought of a human being allowed anywhere near the princess, let alone summoned to her private quarters on a regular basis. "The princess informs me you have been here on multiple occasions this week," he said, his voice carrying a formal coldness that reminded me uncomfortably of the reception hall. "I go where I'm assigned," I said simply, setting my tool bag down near the environmental panel. If there have been repeated issues with the system, I'm happy to do a full inspection to prevent future problems. There have not been repeated issues, Corin said, his eyes narrowing slightly. Not with the system. The implication hung in the air, and I understood exactly what he meant. He suspected, correctly, that the repairs had become an excuse, and he clearly did not approve. Thalira's expression remained calm, though I noticed a slight tightening around her eyes, the kind of look someone gives when they are being scrutinized in front of another person and do not appreciate it. Corin, the systems on this station require regular maintenance regardless of whether a failure has occurred. Would you prefer we wait until something breaks entirely before addressing it? I would prefer, Corin said carefully, that the heir to the Dominion not spend an unusual amount of time in the presence of a human engineer, regardless of how skilled his repairs may be. The words were not unkind exactly, but they carried the same weight I had felt at the reception, the quiet, absolute certainty that humans belonged in a category far beneath Varathi royalty, a category not worth this much attention. I decided the safest path was to simply do my job. I'll begin the inspection now, if that's all right, I said, opening my tool bag and turning my attention to the panel, giving both of them space to continue their conversation without my involvement. They did not continue the conversation, at least not in front of me. Corin remained in the room, watching my every movement with obvious suspicion, while Thalira stood near the window, her arms crossed, saying little as I worked through the inspection. The silence stretched on for nearly 20 minutes before Corin finally spoke again, this time directing his words toward me rather than the princess. "Tell me, human," he said, "what do you hope to gain from these repeated visits?" I did not look up from my work. A functioning environmental system, mostly. That is not what I asked. I straightened up, meeting his gaze directly. "With respect, sir, I don't come here looking to gain anything. I do the work I'm assigned, and I do it well. If the princess has questions for me, I answer them honestly. That's the extent of it." Corin studied me for a long moment, clearly unconvinced. The Varathi have encountered many species over the centuries who sought favor through flattery, through gifts, through elaborate displays meant to win our trust. You have done none of these things, and yet you find yourself here regardless. I find that curious. "Maybe curious isn't a bad thing," I said, returning my attention to the panel. "Or maybe," Corin said, his voice dropping lower, "it is precisely the kind of thing that should concern us most. The quiet ones are often more dangerous than the loud ones." I let the comment pass without response, finishing my inspection in silence. When I finally closed the panel and confirmed the system showed no signs of trouble, Thalira stepped forward. "Thank you for your thoroughness," she said, her tone formal, in a way that told me she was performing for Corin's benefit as much as addressing me directly. "You may go." I gathered my tools and left without further comment, though I could feel Corin's suspicious gaze following me all the way to the door. That night, I found myself thinking about the conversation more than I expected to. Corin was not wrong to be cautious. I was, after all, a stranger from a species his people viewed as inferior, and his role was to protect the princess, not to trust easily. I understood the caution, even if I did not appreciate the tone that came with it. What surprised me more was how much I found myself thinking about Thalira herself, about the way her expression had shifted slightly when Corin questioned her, the small flash of frustration quickly hidden behind formal composure. I recognized something in that moment, the exhaustion of someone who spent every waking hour being watched, judged, and questioned by people who claimed to have her best interests at heart. I did not know what to make of the strange sympathy I felt toward her, given how our first meeting had gone, but I could not deny that it was there. The following week brought a shift in the pattern. Instead of manufactured maintenance requests, Thalira began appearing in places where our paths might reasonably cross without arousing suspicion: the station's observation deck during quiet hours, the small garden module maintained by the botanical staff, even the technical library where I occasionally researched unfamiliar Varathi systems to better understand my work. I did not encourage these encounters, but I did not discourage them either. Our conversations remained careful at first, testing the boundaries of what could be discussed without crossing into territory that might make either of us uncomfortable. She asked questions about human history, about the resource shortages I had grown up during, about the philosophy that had shaped how I approached the world. I answered honestly, without exaggeration or false modesty, and in turn, she began sharing pieces of her own life, carefully at first, then with growing openness. I learned that she had been groomed for leadership since before she could walk, that every lesson of her childhood had centered on the superiority of Varathi civilization, the weakness of lesser species, the importance of maintaining absolute composure in the face of any challenge. I learned that she had never once been allowed to simply exist without the weight of her future title pressing down on every decision, every word, every relationship she formed. "Do you ever wonder," she asked me one evening, as we stood together on the observation deck watching the slow rotation of the gas giant's rings, "what kind of person you might have become without the expectations placed on you since birth?" I considered the question carefully. I think about it sometimes, but my expectations were never as heavy as yours sound. Mostly just, work hard, be honest, don't waste what you've been given. Simple expectations, she said, a note of something like envy in her voice. Simple isn't always easy, I said, but I understand what you mean. It sounds like you've spent your whole life being told who you have to be, without much room to figure out who you actually are. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the rings turn slowly against the dark backdrop of space. "I have never said that aloud to anyone before," she finally admitted. "Not even to Corin, who has known me since I was an infant. Sometimes it's easier to say things to someone who doesn't already have an opinion about who you're supposed to be," I said. She turned to look at me then, her expression thoughtful. "Is that why you find it easy to speak with me? Because you have no expectations of what a Varathi princess should be?" "Something like that," I admitted. "I try not to judge people before I know them. It didn't work out great for me at the reception, but I've decided to keep doing it anyway." That earned a small laugh from her, quiet and genuine, the first time I had heard her laugh at all since we had met. "You bring up that reception often." "Only because you keep giving me the chance to," I said, and she laughed again, a little louder this time. It was a strange thing, standing there with her, watching the rings turn slowly against the darkness, realizing that somewhere along the way, the sharp, dismissive princess from the reception hall had become someone I genuinely enjoyed talking to. I did not know what to make of that shift, or what it meant for either of us, given the vast difference in our stations, our species, our futures. But I did not walk away from those conversations, and neither did she. Not everyone on the station shared our comfort with the arrangement. Corin's suspicion only grew as the weeks passed, and I began noticing him at a distance during my encounters with Thalira, watching from doorways or corridors, never quite close enough to intervene, but never far enough away to be unnoticed either. Grace, too, grew increasingly concerned, though her concern came from a different place than Corin's. "You need to be careful," she told me one evening, as we sat together in the human quarters, the low hum of the station's systems providing a steady backdrop to our conversation. "I'm not saying stop talking to her, I'm saying be aware of what this could mean, for both of you. She's the heir to an entire civilization, Ethan. If this friendship, or whatever it is, becomes something the Varathi High Council disapproves of, it won't just affect her. It could affect every human on this station, maybe every human trying to build a relationship with the Dominion at all." I understood the weight of what she was saying, and I did not dismiss it. "I know the risks, Grace. I'm not trying to cause problems for anyone." "I believe you," Grace said. "I just want you to understand that not everyone will see it that way. Not everyone will believe your intentions are as simple as you think they are." She was right, of course, though I did not fully appreciate how right she was until the situation on the station changed suddenly and without warning, in a way that neither Corin's suspicion nor Grace's caution could have prepared any of us for. It began with an alarm. The sound tore through the station in the middle of what should have been a quiet shift, a piercing signal that meant only one thing to anyone who had worked on Solace Station long enough to recognize it. Hull breach. My hands froze over the panel I had been repairing, and for a single heartbeat, the entire corridor seemed to hold its breath along with me. Then the lights shifted to a deep red, and the calm station voice began repeating coordinates through the overhead speakers. The breach was in the diplomatic wing. I did not think. I grabbed my tool bag and ran. The corridors that had always felt so calm and elegant now echoed with the sound of hurried footsteps and shouted instructions in half a dozen languages. Station security moved past me in the opposite direction, heading toward the evacuation routes, while emergency lighting cast long shadows across walls that had shifted from soft violet to a warning red. I reached the diplomatic wing to find chaos. A section of the outer wall near the Varathi guest quarters had been struck by what I would later learn was a piece of debris from an old mining operation, unnoticed by the station's outer sensors until it was already too close to avoid. The impact had cracked one of the reinforced viewing ports, and the automatic sealing systems built by Varathi engineers who prided themselves on flawless technology, had failed to activate. Air screamed out through the crack in a thin, violent stream, and the emergency bulkheads that should have sealed the section automatically remained frozen, caught in some kind of system fault that the frightened technicians gathered nearby could not identify quickly enough. Through the chaos, I spotted Corin near the sealed inner door, shouting instructions to a group of Varathi engineers who worked frantically at a control panel that refused to respond. Beyond him, through the transparent inner wall, I could see figures still trapped in the outer section, moving with the sluggish, desperate motion of people whose air was rapidly thinning. One of those figures wore robes I recognized instantly, even through the haze of escaping atmosphere. Thalira. "The override system has failed," one of the Varathi engineers shouted, his voice cracking with panic that no amount of cultural composure could fully hide in that moment. "The bulkhead controls are not responding to any command sequence." I pushed forward, ignoring the surprised look Corin gave me as I approached the panel. "Let me see it." "This is not your concern," Corin snapped, though there was no real force behind the words, only the frantic edge of someone running out of options. "Your princess is on the other side of that door," I said, already reaching for the panel. "That makes it my concern." I did not wait for permission. I pulled the access panel open and began scanning the exposed wiring, my training kicking in through the fear, the same steady focus that had carried me through every difficult repair I had ever completed. The Varathi system was more complex than anything I typically worked with, but the underlying logic was not so different from systems I had studied during my years of training, and I forced myself to think through the problem methodically rather than letting the panic around me take hold. "The primary control relay has fused," I said, mostly to myself, tracing the pathway of a scorched wire with my fingers. "That's why the override isn't responding. The system is trying to run the command through a relay that no longer exists." "Can you fix it?" Corin demanded, his composed exterior finally cracking under the weight of the situation. "I need 30 seconds, I said, already pulling tools from my bag. "Maybe less." Through the transparent inner wall, I could see Thalira had gathered 2 other Varathi staff members near her, pulling them toward the section of the outer wall furthest from the breach, trying to buy whatever time she could. Even in the middle of a crisis, even as the air thinned around her, she moved with a kind of steady purpose that told me she was doing everything she could to protect the people around her, rather than simply saving herself. My hands worked quickly, rerouting the damaged relay through a secondary pathway I identified in the wiring, a solution I would not have found without years of experience solving problems on systems that were never designed with easy repairs in mind. The seconds stretched painfully long, the sound of the escaping air a constant, terrifying reminder of how little time remained. "Got it," I said, closing the final connection and stepping back. "Try the override now." The engineer at the main panel entered the command sequence with shaking hands, and for one agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, with a heavy mechanical groan, the emergency bulkhead began to slide shut, sealing the breach and cutting off the flow of escaping atmosphere entirely. A moment later, the inner door hissed open, and the trapped group stumbled through into the safety of the sealed corridor, coughing and gasping in the thinner air they had been breathing. Thalira was the last through the door, having stayed behind to help the others ahead of her, and she nearly collapsed the moment she crossed the threshold. I caught her before she fell, one arm bracing her shoulders as she steadied herself against me, her breathing ragged but steady. "You," she said, once she had caught enough breath to speak, staring up at me with an expression that held none of the sharp composure I had come to expect from her. "You fixed it." "I did what anyone would have done," I said. "No," she said, shaking her head slowly. "You did what our own engineers could not." Around us, station medical staff arrived to check on the survivors, and Corin knelt beside Thalira, his composed exterior fully gone now, replaced by the raw relief of someone who had nearly lost the person he had sworn to protect since childhood. I stepped back to give them space, my hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the past several minutes, and watched as the diplomatic wing slowly returned to some semblance of order. Emergency crews worked to assess the damage. Station officials began the process of understanding how a piece of debris had gone undetected by systems that were supposed to be flawless, and I found myself standing quietly to the side, feeling the exhaustion of the crisis settle into my bones. It was nearly an hour later, once the medical staff had cleared everyone involved and the immediate danger had passed, that Thalira found me again, sitting alone on a bench near the edge of the damaged section, still processing everything that had happened. She sat down beside me without asking permission, something she had never done before, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. "I have spent my entire life," she finally said, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it, "believing that Varathi engineering was without equal, that our systems were flawless, that our technology represented the pinnacle of what any civilization could achieve. Today, that belief nearly cost me my life, and the lives of everyone trapped with me. Systems fail sometimes," I said, "no matter who builds them." "Perhaps," she said, "but it was not simply the system that failed today. It was a belief I had never once questioned, that our way was always superior, that other species had nothing meaningful to offer beyond what we chose to grant them." She turned to look at me, her violet eyes steady, despite the exhaustion clearly written across her face. "You saved my life today, Ethan Marsh. You, and the very species I mocked, in front of an entire hall of my own people." I did not know quite what to say to that, so I said nothing, giving her the space to continue. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "Not the careless words I offered you weeks ago in that corridor, but a true one. What I said to you at the reception was cruel, and worse than cruel, it was ignorant. I judged your entire species based on nothing more than the arrogance I had been raised to believe was simply fact. I was wrong, Ethan. Today proved to me exactly how wrong I was." I studied her for a moment, seeing past the title, past the robe still faintly torn from the chaos of the crisis, and saw instead a young woman confronting the collapse of beliefs she had carried her entire life. "You didn't know better," I said finally. "Now you do. That's enough." She shook her head slightly. "It should not be so simple. I insulted you, humiliated you, in front of everyone I know, and you offer me forgiveness as though it costs you nothing." "It doesn't cost me anything," I said. "Holding on to anger doesn't undo what happened. It just makes both of us carry something heavier than we need to. You've said what you needed to say. I believe you mean it. That's enough for me." She was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I had never seen on her before, something raw and unguarded, stripped of every layer of formal composure she had been trained to maintain since childhood. "You are a remarkable person, Ethan Marsh," she said finally. "I'm just an engineer who was in the right place at the right time," I said. "No," she said firmly. "You are far more than that, whether you choose to see it or not." We sat together in silence after that, watching the emergency crews finish their work in the damaged section of the diplomatic wing, and I found myself thinking that whatever strange, unexpected path had brought us to this moment, sitting side by side after a crisis that had nearly cost her life, something fundamental had shifted between us, and likely, though I did not yet fully understand it, something fundamental had shifted in how the Varathi Dominion would come to see humanity as well. News of the breach spread through Solace Station within hours, and with it, the story of how a single human engineer had repaired a failed Varathi system in less than a minute, saving the life of the Dominion's heir and everyone trapped alongside her. By the following morning, the story had grown in the retelling, as stories often do. though the core of it remained true enough that I did not feel the need to correct the exaggerations that followed. Grace found me in the human quarters that afternoon, carrying a tablet filled with what looked like an overwhelming number of messages. "You're famous," she said, setting the tablet down in front of me. "Not just here. Reports of what happened have already reached Earth's diplomatic office. There's talk of using this incident as an example in the ongoing negotiations with the Dominion." I stared at the tablet, scrolling through message after message, requests for statements, congratulations from officials I had never met, even a formal note of gratitude from the human ambassador stationed on Solace, who had been recovering from illness during the entire incident and had only just learned what happened in his absence. "I didn't do this to make a statement," I said, setting the tablet back down. "I know that," Grace said, "but sometimes the things we do without trying to make a statement end up making the loudest ones anyway." She was right, though I did not fully understand how right she was until the following week, when I was summoned to a formal gathering of the Varathi High Council, an event far more significant than the reception where everything had first begun. The council chamber was larger than the reception hall, built with towering windows that looked out over the full expanse of the gas giant's rings, and filled with Varathi officials whose robes and markings suggested ranks far above even the nobles who had surrounded Thalira during our first encounter. I stood near the entrance, feeling distinctly out of place among the gathered dignitaries, until Thalira herself approached and guided me toward a position near the front of the chamber. "You do not need to say anything," she murmured, as we walked together. "Simply stand here. Let them see you." I did not entirely understand what she meant until the proceedings began, and I realized that my presence itself was meant to serve as a quiet statement, a living reminder to every skeptical Varathi official in that chamber that the species they had long dismissed as primitive had proven itself capable of far more than they had ever acknowledged. The formal proceedings covered matters of trade and diplomacy that meant little to me directly, until the presiding council member, an elderly Varathi woman whose authority was clear in the way the entire chamber quieted whenever she spoke, addressed the incident in the diplomatic wing directly. "It has come to this council's attention," she said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber, "that the human engineer Ethan Marsh acted with exceptional skill and courage during the recent breach in our diplomatic quarters, preventing what could have been a significant loss of life, including that of the Dominion's own heir." A murmur passed through the gathered officials, and I felt the weight of dozens of eyes settling on me once again, though this time the atmosphere felt different from the reception hall weeks earlier. Less mockery, more genuine curiosity, mixed with something that might have been reluctant respect. "This council recognizes," the elderly woman continued, "that our assumptions regarding the capabilities of humanity may require reconsideration. Skill, it seems, is not bound by the shape of a species, nor by the length of its history among the stars." It was not a grand apology, not the kind of sweeping statement that might have made for a satisfying end to a story, but I understood the significance of it regardless. For a council of ancient, deeply traditional beings to publicly acknowledge that their assumptions about an entire species required reconsideration was no small thing, and I could see from the expressions around the chamber that not everyone present agreed easily with the sentiment. Corin, standing near the council dais, caught my eye briefly and gave the smallest possible nod, an acknowledgement I understood to be as close to an apology as his formal position would ever allow him to offer. The proceedings continued, and eventually shifted to matters unrelated to the incident, and I found myself standing quietly near the front of the chamber, absorbing the strange reality that a single choice, made weeks earlier in a reception hall, to walk away rather than argue, had somehow led to this moment. After the council session ended, I found myself once again in a crowded room filled with Varathi nobles, though this gathering felt distinctly different from the reception where everything had begun. Word of the council's acknowledgement had spread quickly through the assembled guests, and the atmosphere carried a different kind of energy, curious rather than dismissive, though not entirely free of the old prejudices that had shaped Varathi culture for centuries. I stood near the edge of the room, a drink in hand, watching Thalira move through the crowd with a confidence that seemed different from before, less performance, more genuine ease, as though the crisis in the diplomatic wing had loosened something in her that had been held too tightly for too long. It was during this gathering that the final test of everything that had changed presented itself, though I did not recognize it as such until it was already unfolding. A young Varathi noble, one I did not recognize, approached the small group I stood near, his expression carrying the same dismissive superiority I remembered from my very first night on the station. "I understand you are the human who fixed a wiring fault," he said, his tone carrying an edge of mockery that reminded me instantly of the reception hall weeks earlier. "A fortunate accident, I am told. Nothing more than luck, surely, given your species' limited understanding of true engineering." The comment was clearly meant to provoke, a deliberate attempt to diminish what had happened, perhaps out of genuine skepticism, perhaps simply out of the same wounded pride that had driven Thalira's own words weeks earlier. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the same quiet sting of being reduced to nothing in front of a room full of strangers. I opened my mouth, ready to offer the same calm, measured response I had given before, prepared to simply set down my drink and walk away without argument, the way I always had. But before I could speak, Thalira was there, stepping between us with a sharpness in her expression that immediately silenced the young noble's smug confidence. "Careful," she said, her voice cutting through the surrounding conversation with an authority that left no room for misunderstanding. "You speak of luck regarding a repair that our own engineers, trained since childhood in systems of our own design, failed to accomplish in time to prevent my death. I assure you, there was nothing fortunate about it. There was skill, precision, and courage that this council has already formally acknowledged." The young noble's confidence faltered visibly under her words, and he offered a hasty, mumbled apology before retreating quickly into the crowd, clearly unwilling to continue a confrontation with the heir to the Dominion, defending someone he had assumed would offer no resistance at all. Thalira turned to me once the noble had gone, her expression softening slightly. "You did not need to say anything," she said. "I saw what you were about to do. Walk away again, without argument." "Old habits," I said. "Perhaps," she said, "but you should know, you no longer need to carry every insult alone. Not on this station, not while I stand here." I studied her for a long moment, seeing clearly now how far she had come from the sharp, dismissive princess who had mocked me in front of 200 strangers weeks earlier. The change had not come through argument or confrontation, but through something quieter, a willingness to question what she had been taught, to see past the assumptions she had carried her entire life, and to grow into someone far more thoughtful than the person I had first encountered. "Thank you," I said simply. "You saved my life," she said. "Defending you against the careless words of one arrogant noble is a small thing in comparison." We stood together for a while longer, watching the gathering continue around us, the conversation gradually shifting toward lighter topics as the tension from the earlier confrontation faded. I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened since that first night, the insult that had started it all, the quiet choice to walk away rather than argue, the slow, unexpected friendship that had grown from that single decision, and finally, the crisis that had tested everything and left something stronger in its place. In the weeks that followed, the relationship between the human delegation and the Varathi Dominion shifted in ways that reached far beyond Solace Station. Reports of the incident, and the Council's acknowledgement that followed, spread through diplomatic channels on both sides, opening doors to conversations that had previously stalled under the weight of old assumptions and mutual distrust. Humanity did not gain the Dominion's respect through force or grand declarations, but through the quiet proof of what a single person could accomplish when given the chance, and through the willingness of one young princess to question everything she had been taught in order to see the truth clearly. Thalira continued her role as heir to the Dominion, though I noticed a change in how she carried that role afterward, less concerned with proving Varathi's superiority, more interested in genuinely understanding the species her people encountered across the stars. She became known, quietly at first and then more openly, as an advocate for fair treatment between humans and Varathi, using her growing influence to challenge the old prejudices that had shaped her upbringing. As for me, I remained an engineer, mostly, though my role on the station expanded in ways I had never expected, serving occasionally as an informal bridge between human and Varathi teams working through the technical challenges of an increasingly connected relationship between our species. I often thought back to that first night, standing in the reception hall, glass in hand, listening to a 19-year-old princess insult everything I represented in front of a room full of strangers. I thought about the choice I made in that moment, not to argue, not to defend myself with words, but simply to set down my glass and walk away, trusting that my silence would say more than any argument ever could. I had not known, standing there in that hall, that a single quiet choice would ripple outward into something far larger than either of us could have imagined. A shift, not just in one princess's understanding of the world, but in the relationship between two entire civilizations learning, slowly and imperfectly, to see each other clearly for the first time. Some nights, I still sit by the window in the human quarters, watching the rings of the gas giant catch the light of a distant sun, and I think about my father's words, the ones he offered me long before I ever imagined standing in a room full of aliens, being mocked for the simple fact of being human. Respect is not something you demand, it is something you earn through what you build, not what you say. I had built nothing that night in the reception hall except silence, and somehow, against every expectation, that silence had built something far greater than I ever could have argued into existence.